Blind old man, shooting like a joke. The soldiers roared with laughter, the sound crashing straight into the ground like boots stomping on a corpse. On the stage, Charles Lyons wore the filthy smile of a man long used to crushing others without ever dirtying his hands. An old veteran missed his shot. Cameras across the state were rolling, and in everyone's eyes, this was nothing more than a public humiliation, legal, sanctioned, and broadcast live. Everything was already decided. But wait, don't blink. Just seconds later, in a single moment, the third bullet did not strike the target. It drove straight into the ground, and when the range officer bent down to check behind the target, what surfaced silenced all of Hero Range. Black water bubbled up, camouflage fabric emerged, half of a cold dog tag. History had just torn its own face open and thrown it straight at the man standing above everyone else. That old man was never finished. He was Thomas Hale, a former marksman who stayed silent for 30 years, now standing face to face with the man who buried his teammate alive, and the hero on the stage, Charles Lyons, a symbol polished by lies, now trembling as his own voice confessed before the entire nation. If you were Thomas, would you stay silent to survive, or let the ground speak the rest? If this story left you breathless, subscribe now and leave a comment. Would you choose silence or truth? Share this, because the questions we avoid always come back with a higher price. The Texas sun poured down on the desert like a sheet of red-hot metal, not the brilliant sun of tourism or cinema, but the kind of sun that burned human skin, layer by layer, forcing every living creature to bow its head. The ground around Hero Range cracked open into tangled fracture lines, dry, desiccated, hard like old bone. The wind blew along the rusted iron fence surrounding the shooting range, screeching in short bursts, sharp and cold, sounding like metal being dragged across concrete. Hero Range today did not resemble a shooting range. Old wall sections were hastily repainted, American flags hung along the entrance, and loudspeakers were added onto steel poles. A temporary stage was erected in the middle of the open lot, covered in dark blue fabric, with large lettering on the front reading Veterans Honor Day. Television trucks were parked in rows, antennas rising like signal probes in the desert. The crowd gathered more densely by the minute. Young soldiers in neatly pressed uniforms, veterans' families, small-town residents curious, standing tucked beneath the rare shade of a few canvas sheets. Cameras panned slowly across individual faces, smiles prepared in advance, nods delivered on cue. This was a ceremony carefully calculated, every camera angle, every line spoken, every movement rehearsed beforehand. A program for live broadcast across the entire state, to retell a familiar story about honor, sacrifice, and national pride. On the dais, General Charles Lyons appeared on time. He wore a sharply pressed uniform, rows of medals on his chest, catching the lights and glittering. His graying hair was neatly combed, his sun-darkened face carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to standing before crowds. Lyons did not need to look at the paper. He knew exactly what he needed to say and when to smile. When we speak about honor, he spoke in a low, clear voice, carried through the speakers. We speak about the people who placed the country above themselves. The crowd applauded. The camera captured that moment, slowly zooming in on Lyons's face. His smile was warm enough, serious enough, a perfect symbol of the image of military integrity that his campaign was building. Below the dais, young soldiers stood in rows, some exchanging glances, some trying to maintain composure. A reporter leaned toward a colleague, whispered something, then adjusted her microphone. The atmosphere was both formal and carried a trace of excitement from a major event rare in this town. But not everyone was looking at the dais. Behind the stage, inside a temporary technical room built from a steel container, Evelyn Cooper sat in front of the audio control panels. The room was cramped, hot, and the smell of electrical wires and metal mixed in the air. She lowered her head, concentrating on the blinking sound levels in front of her, ears covered by old headphones with worn padding. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her neck, a few strands falling onto her forehead. With each uneven breath, her hand rested on the volume control lever, trembling slightly. Not much, but enough for her to feel. Evelyn took a deep breath once, then again, forcing her breathing to remain steady. She had done this job for many years, long enough to know that trembling was not permitted, regardless of the reason. Through the small glass pane of the technical room, she could see the shooting range stretching out, target boards lined up neatly under the sun. Lane 4 lay slightly off to the right, near an area rarely used. Behind it, a low strip of land where old pipelines once ran. No one stood there at the moment, No one paid attention. In the pocket of her light jacket, Evelyn clearly felt the old paper pressing with every movement. She had folded it very carefully, but the creases had softened over time. On that sheet were only a few short lines, slanted and trembling handwriting, as if the person who wrote it did not want it to exist for long. Come to lane 4, where Ray stopped. 3 days earlier, Evelyn herself had placed that envelope into a mailbox in town, without writing a return address. She was not sure whether the recipient would come or not. She only knew she could not keep it any longer. A young technician stepped into the room, glanced at the control panels, then spoke, his tone polite but hurried. "The sound is fine, Mrs. Cooper. We're about to move to the next introduction segment." Evelyn nodded without looking up. "Fine," she replied briefly. Outside, Lyons continued his speech. He spoke of years of service, of discipline, of silent sacrifices few people ever saw. Each sentence was complete, just emotional enough. The crowd listened, some nodding, some quickly wiping sweat away. A reporter stepped forward, microphone extended toward Lyons. "Sir," she asked, "do you believe that the truth in the military is always protected?" Lyons did not hesitate. He smiled, a familiar smile, and answered, "The truth always needs to be placed in the right position, and sometimes it needs to be controlled, so it does not damage greater values." The answer was delivered smoothly, without a single stumble. The camera captured the moment in full. Inside the technical room, Evelyn gently closed her eyes. Lyons' words echoed in her headphones, clear down to every syllable. She opened her eyes, staring straight at the screen in front of her, where the image of the shooting range appeared sharply under the sun. "Today," she whispered, her voice so small only she herself could hear, "the ground will not remain silent." Outside, the wind blew stronger, lifting dust in thin waves. The American flag hanging near the stage fluttered, its frayed fabric lightly striking the metal pole. A few people in the crowd shaded their eyes, looking toward the range, where cracked earth stretched out like a large scar that would never heal. The cameras shifted scenes according to the predetermined script, sweeping across the dais, across the crowd, then toward the shooting area, prepared for the next program segment. Everything unfolded exactly according to plan, too exactly, and then, the image on the screen in the technical room cut to a different scene. An old wooden house appeared, standing alone in the barren land. Afternoon sunlight slipped through worn curtain gaps, casting down onto a wooden table full of scratches. On the tabletop, an old envelope lay still, its paper edges yellowed by time. The camera moved closer, close enough to clearly see the name written on the envelope, Thomas Hale. The image stopped there, like a door that had just closed, leaving behind a heavy feeling not yet given a name. Thomas Hale's wooden house sat tucked away in the middle of the desert, far enough from town that the sound of traffic never reached it. Wind passed through the warped and cracked planks, making the house creak in slow, even beats, like an old person turning in shallow sleep. The sound no longer drew Thomas's attention. It had been there since he moved in, and it was still there every morning when he woke up alone. Inside the house, everything remained in its old place. There were no new furnishings, and no sign of change. On a wooden table set close to the wall, a faded M14 lay horizontally, the body covered in small scratches, the metal dulled by time. It was not covered, nor was it placed with ceremony. It lay there like a familiar object that had gone too long without being called by name. Thomas walked past the table, placed his hand on the stock for a brief moment, then pulled it back. The motion happened naturally, without thought. He had done it many times, on windless mornings, on blazing afternoons, on nights when sleep did not come. The envelope lay at the edge of the table, where the light from the window fell most clearly. Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at the envelope for a while before reaching out to open it. The paper was thin and soft, the corners worn. The cassette tape slid out first, followed by a small piece of paper. On it, the handwriting slanted and trembled. Signed E. Cooper. Thomas looked at that line longer than necessary. That name had not appeared in his life for many years, but it had never left his memory. He set the paper down on the table, right beside the rifle, then picked up the cassette. The plastic felt cold and smooth beneath his fingertips. The old tape player sat on a wooden shelf against the wall. Thomas took it down, wiped the thin layer of dust away with his sleeve, then inserted the cassette. When he pressed the button, the machine gave off a familiar clicking sound, like something that had waited a long time to be awakened. The first sound that came through was wind, humming, uneven, as if the microphone had been placed outdoors. After that came a man's voice, low and hoarse, broken up by short gaps. If I don't come back, the voice said, slow and heavy, tell Evelyn that I'm still at lane 4. Thomas stood still. He did not sit down, nor did he step closer. He listened, but did not react. The voice did not startle him. It only made something that had already existed inside him clearer. A gunshot sounded on the tape, dry and final. Immediately after came silence. There were no further words, no breathing, only a stretch of emptiness. Thomas raised his hand and stopped the tape. He did not rewind. He did not need to know what came after. The tape player continued to turn slowly for a brief beat. Then he switched it off. The house returned to quiet, leaving only the wind and the sound of old wood contracting in the heat of late afternoon. Thomas's gaze shifted to the opposite wall. The photograph hanging there had faded. Two young soldiers stood beside each other on the training ground, uniforms, dusty, smiling at the camera as if everything ahead still held time. Ray Cooper stood on the right, shoulder touching Thomas's, his smile wide and relaxed. Thomas looked at the photograph for a long time. He could not remember when he had hung it there. Perhaps it was after that day. Perhaps it was to remind himself of something he had never said out loud to anyone. His hand slid down into his jacket pocket and touched an old shell casing. The piece of metal was cold and rough, familiar enough that he did not need to look. He took it out and placed it on the table beside the cassette. His fingers tightened once, enough to clearly feel the sharp edge, then released. That day, Thomas said quietly, his voice rough. I turned away. The words fell into the empty house. No one answered. He tapped ash into a chipped ceramic ashtray. The cigarette was still burning, but he no longer raised it to his mouth. Thin smoke drifted upward and quickly dissolved in the pale light. 30 years earlier, the training exercise had unfolded like hundreds of others. The order was given briefly. The target was fixed. No one expected anything beyond the familiar repetition. When the gunshot rang out, everything changed within seconds. Ray fell. Blood soaked into the ground. The people around him froze, then shifted into trained reflex. The report was written quickly, the wording precise and clean. A training accident, no signs of irregularity. The file was closed. Thomas was there. He saw enough to understand what had happened. He also saw enough to know he should remain silent. When asked, he answered just enough. When no one asked further, he said nothing. That silence allowed everything to keep functioning, and kept his name from being spoken. After that came whispers, scattered and never loud enough to become accusations. Ray had gathered evidence. Ray wanted to speak with superiors. The Death Benefits Fund had issues. The name Charles Lyons appeared in a few short remarks, then disappeared. Thomas listened, remembered, and remained silent. Someone once looked at him and asked a very short question. What did you see? Thomas had answered. I saw an accident. That answer followed him for many years, even though the one who asked had left his life long ago. The afternoon sunlight shifted, shining directly onto half of Thomas's face. The wrinkles stood out clearly, unhidden. His eyes looked into space, not focused on anything in the house. He stood up, took an old cloth, and wiped down the M14. The motions were slow, even, precise. He wiped the barrel, the stock, then set it down on the table. He checked the bolt, lightly touched the metal, then stopped. Thomas stood straight. His posture remained intact, as if his body had never forgotten what it had learned. He placed the rifle back in its old position, then picked up the cassette and returned it to the envelope. He folded it carefully and put it into his jacket pocket. There was nothing else to take. Thomas stepped out the door. Outdoor light flooded in, brightening the house for a brief beat. He closed the door behind him. The sound of wood meeting frame dry and clean. The pickup truck was parked beside the dirt road. Thomas placed the rifle on the passenger seat, then sat in the driver's seat. He did not start the engine right away. His hand rested on the steering wheel, holding still. In that moment, there was no image of Hero Range, no loudspeakers, no crowd. There was only the envelope in his jacket pocket, the shell casing lying on the table in the house whose door had just closed, and the memory of a man who had fallen in a place the report called safe. Thomas lowered his head and looked at the clock on the dashboard. The second hand was still moving. He was still sitting there. The old pickup truck rolled along the desert road, stretching endlessly ahead, the engine rumbling evenly, like a breath, long accustomed to solitude. Dust rose behind the wheels, clinging to the windshield, as an opaque film, even as the wipers worked steadily. Thomas Hale looked through that layer of dust, his eyes neither narrowing nor trying to wipe it away. The road ahead appeared just clearly enough to continue, exactly like the way he had lived for many years, knowing just enough, seeing just enough, not trying to clarify anything further. On both sides of the road, the desert spread wide, flat, and barren. There was no sign that this place had ever held anyone's memories. Thomas drove by habit, without much thought. Each stretch of road stirred fragmented images in him. Old movements between bases, early mornings getting into vehicles before the sky had fully lightened. Back then, he often did not know where he was going, only that he had to go. Hero Range appeared after a wide bend. More suddenly than Thomas expected, a large tract of land was enclosed by an iron fence. Above, American flags flapped hard in the wind. Banners were strung up hastily, their bright colors standing out against the pale ground. Loudspeakers mounted on steel poles broadcast familiar slogans, the voice loud and even, repeating phrases about honor, service, sacrifice. Thomas slowed down. He was not in a hurry. The truck rolled slowly into the temporary parking area, where several dozen other vehicles were already lined up. Television trucks were parked close to the fence, antennas rising, cables stretched across the ground like tangled tendons. Thomas shut off the engine and sat still for a moment before opening the door. Desert wind rushed in, carrying the smell of dust and heated metal. He stepped down from the truck, his movements slow, his back slightly stooped with age, but each step still steady. His gaze stayed fixed ahead, not scanning, not curious. Hero Range had changed. Rows of targets had been repainted, firing lanes marked more clearly. A temporary stage stood in the central area, where stage lights were still on despite the midday sun. Thomas glanced over it, then shifted his eyes toward the registration area on the left. A few young soldiers stood nearby, laughing and talking. As Thomas passed, one whistled softly. The old guy came to attend the ceremony. The voice carried a hint of mockery. Another laughed and replied, "Maybe he's here to tell us war stories." Thomas did not react. He kept walking, as if the sounds had not reached him. There were tones he had heard long ago, only coming from different mouths. On the stage, Charles Lyons had just finished a segment of his speech. He turned to shake hands with another veteran, his smile unchanged, but his eyes swept quickly over the crowd. When that gaze reached Thomas, it paused for a beat shorter than usual. Lyons tilted his head slightly, as if trying to confirm something. He stepped down a few steps, moving closer to the edge of the stage. As Thomas passed through his line of sight, Lyons spoke, his voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This is interesting. History likes to return to old places." Thomas stopped for a very brief moment and turned his head to look at Lyons. Their eyes met. There was no challenge and no friendliness, only recognition. Thomas nodded lightly, a reflex of courtesy, then turned and continued. Lyons remained standing, his smile slipping half a beat. He adjusted the medals on his chest, then turned back toward the stage, continuing his role before the cameras. Thomas reached the registration table. A young staffer wearing a Hero Range polo shirt looked up, scanning Thomas from head to toe. "You here to shoot?" he asked, his voice slightly hesitant. Thomas placed his documents on the table. "Yes." The staffer flipped through the logbook, searching for the name. When he found Thomas Hale, he looked up again. "It's been a long time since you shot here," he said, as if confirming it. "Long enough," Thomas replied. The staffer looked down at the lane assignment chart. His finger paused briefly. "Lane 4 isn't used much," he said, his voice lower. "There's an old pipeline behind it, sometimes unstable." Thomas looked straight at him. "I know." The short answer stopped any further questions. The staffer made a note in the logbook, then handed Thomas a small card. "3 shots," he said. 300 meters. Thomas took the card, nodded, and walked away. There was no thank you, and no explanation. In the technical room behind the stage, Evelyn Cooper was watching the monitors. Sound from the outdoor speakers came clearly through her headphones. When she heard the lane number spoken over the internal radio channel, her hand tightened around the headset. "Lane 4. The technician's voice came through the channel. Evelyn did not respond. Her lips pressed together, her eyes fixed on the screen showing the distant firing range. Thomas walked along the firing line to his position. Lane 4 sat slightly offset, farther from the central area than the others. Behind the target was a low stretch of darker ground where grass rarely grew. Thomas stepped into position, set his gun bag down, and opened the zipper. He took out the M14, placed it on the rest, and adjusted the position inch by inch. Around him, voices continued, but quieter now. A few people began to notice the way Thomas handled the rifle. His movements were slow, without excess, without haste. He checked the scope, adjusted the rest, then stood upright for a moment, as if allowing his body to remember the old stance. On the stage, Lyons glanced toward the firing area. He frowned very slightly, then quickly relaxed. Turning to a reporter waiting with a question, Evelyn leaned toward the control board, adjusting a small lever. The sound from the speakers became clearer. She heard the faint clink of metal as Thomas set the rifle on the rest. A voice rang out from the loudspeakers, clear and decisive, cutting through all other sounds. Shooter Thomas Hale. 3 shots. Distance 300 meters. The sound spread across Hero Range, carried over the iron fences, and echoed back from the hard, dry ground. A few people turned their heads. A few quiet laughs sounded, then faded. Thomas stood still at the firing position, both hands resting on the rifle. He did not look toward the crowd, nor up at the stage. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, on the target at the end of the lane, where lane 4 ended. The wind picked up briefly. The flag above the stage fluttered. No one said anything else. 3 shots. 300 meters. Hero Range waited for the first gunshot. Hero Range settled into a very particular kind of quiet, not complete silence, but the kind that forms when many sounds overlap and then lower at the same time. The wind still blew through the iron fence. The loudspeakers still emitted a steady background hum, but the crowd's attention had shifted entirely to the firing area. The murmured conversations from moments earlier thinned out, replaced by eyes fixed on lane 4, where Thomas Hale stood alone. Thomas placed his feet exactly where they needed to be, adjusting his stance as a reflex deeply embedded in his body. He raised the M14 and set the stock against his shoulder, without haste, without hesitation. His breathing was steady and slow, his chest rising and falling in a familiar cycle. 30 years earlier, he had stood like this hundreds of times, under harsher conditions, with targets that did not remain still. Like the paper target in front of him, he tilted his head very slightly, his eye pressed close to the scope. The world ahead narrowed into a small circle, where the center of the target sat still, white and clear. The surrounding sounds faded. Thomas held his breath at its lowest point, his finger resting on the trigger. The explosion rang out, dry and final, cutting through the oppressive midday heat. The first round left the barrel, straight and clean, passing through the center of the target. A neat circular hole appeared dead center, the paper lightly torn around the edges. In the crowd, a small O slipped out, not loud, but enough to spread quickly. A few people turned to look at one another, surprise clearly visible on their faces. The earlier laughter stopped completely, replaced by genuine attention. Thomas did not lower the rifle. He made only a very slight adjustment, almost imperceptible to outsiders. His breathing remained unchanged. His finger squeezed the trigger a second time. The second report sounded immediately after, nearly matching the first beat. The bullet flew out and struck the same spot, widening the hole in the target. No scope adjustment, no shift in stance. The 2 shots overlapped, as if only a single round had been fired. The silence spread further. Those standing closest began to change posture, leaning forward. A few reporters signaled their cameramen to zoom in tighter on the firing line. On the stage, Charles Lyons narrowed his eyes slightly, his attention breaking away from the unfinished speech and locking onto Thomas. Lyons stood still, but his body was not fully relaxed. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, even though the sun and temperature had not changed from moments before. He lifted a hand to adjust his collar, a small movement that did not escape those accustomed to watching him. "He can still shoot," someone murmured in the crowd. It was unclear who, but the words carried far enough for a few others to hear. Thomas kept the rifle in firing position. He did not look to either side, nor toward the stage. His gaze moved off the center of the target and slowly lowered, deliberate and controlled. The scope no longer pointed at the paper. It slid downward past the target's edge, toward the ground behind it, where the sand was darker, and the earth dipped slightly. Lane 4 ended there. Thomas adjusted his stance, but not to improve accuracy. His shoulder dropped slightly. His wrist loosened. He did not hold his breath as long as with the previous 2 shots. His breathing remained steady, but it was no longer compressed at the optimal point. A young soldier standing behind him laughed, the sound bursting out unexpectedly. "He's out of juice," the soldier said, his tone tinged with mockery. A few others laughed along, as if reclaiming the earlier, familiar mood. Lyons noticed the change. He leaned forward slightly, as though trying to see more clearly what was happening at the end of the firing lane. His expression was no longer calm. It carried a vague alertness, a feeling difficult to name. Thomas looked through the scope one last time, but what he saw was not the target. It was the empty ground behind it, where the wind often blew strongly. And grass rarely grew. He did not aim for long. He whispered, very softly, only enough for himself to hear, "This one is for the one who stayed silent too long." His finger pulled the trigger. The report rang out, loud and clear. echoing off the iron fence and surrounding metal surfaces. The bullet shot forward, missing the target entirely and driving straight into the ground behind it. Sand and dirt burst upward for a brief moment, forming a small cloud before quickly settling back down. A very short beat of silence followed, just long enough for the crowd's minds to process what they had seen. Then laughter erupted. Some people clapped, others shook their heads. Jokes were voiced openly now, without restraint. "Knew it," one voice said. "2 shots and he's done." Thomas lowered the rifle and placed it back onto the rest. He did not turn to look at the crowd, nor did he react to the sounds behind him. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the fine dust that had just been kicked up, briefly blurring the ground behind the target. Lyons let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. The smile returned to his face, clearer this time, more natural. He turned and said something to the person beside him, his voice low but relieved. Over the loudspeakers, the coordinator's voice was CE prepared to come on, ready to move the ceremony to its next segment. At lane 4, the ground behind the target remained slightly disturbed, the darker soil clearly visible against the dry sand. No one paid attention to it. Not yet. While laughter was still hanging in the air, the ground behind the target trembled in a short, very light pulse, as if someone had knocked from below. At first, no one noticed. The wind carried the fine dust left from the third shot, sweeping across lane 4 and spreading the darker patch of ground behind the target a little farther. Then a small popping sound broke out, not loud, but distinctly different from the sound of gravel breaking or earth settling. A column of dark water burst up from the ground, shooting straight into the air before falling back down, breaking apart into dark droplets. The water smelled of old metal and mud. Unlike the clean water of the range's system, it spread quickly across the dry sand, forming an unnatural dark streak. The laughter stopped completely. A few of the people closest stepped back by reflex. A technician turned to look at a colleague, as if to ask what had just happened. On the stage, Lyons stopped speaking mid-sentence. He tilted his head, looking toward lane 4, his smile not yet withdrawn from his face. Thomas remained standing at the firing position. He did not step forward, nor did he step back. His gaze rested on the patch of ground that had just been torn open, where the dark water continued to seep out in small pulses. A piece of fabric emerged from the mud, green and brown in color, the familiar pattern of field camouflage. It did not lie neatly like abandoned gear, but was caught in the earth at a twisted angle, as if pulled up from below. The fabric was frayed and torn at the edges, and did not belong to any equipment currently in use at Hero Range. A young soldier standing nearby hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. He bent down and gently pulled the fabric a little farther out. Mud clung to his hand, wet and heavy. He stopped, took a short breath, then pulled again. A piece of metal flashed in the sunlight. He released his grip, then bent down again, this time more carefully. His fingers trembled slightly as he brushed the mud aside, revealing half of a military dog tag. The metal was tarnished, the surface scratched, the engraved letters faded, but still readable. He swallowed, his voice catching as he read it aloud. R. Cooper, Hero Range. That sound carried more clearly than the loudspeakers still on behind him. It did not need amplification. It spread on its own, reaching everyone within hearing distance. The air froze, the wind passed through the iron fence, the screech of metal ringing out, bare and exposed. A few people raised their hands to their mouths. A reporter forgot to hold on to the microphone, eyes wide as he stared toward lane 4. The camera, running on automatic, zoomed in, as if it too recognized that something was wrong. Lyons stepped down from the stage. His face went pale for a brief beat, then quickly shifted into anger. "What is going on here?" he shouted, his voice breaking halfway. He pointed toward the firing area. "Who authorized digging there?" Thomas turned his head and looked at Lyons. There was no challenge in his eyes, only quiet confirmation. Another man, older, stepped closer to the young soldier. He bent down and used his shoe to gently scrape away the surrounding dirt. A single small motion was enough to reveal more of what lay beneath. A section of off-white bone appeared, curved and clear, impossible to mistake for anything else. A sharp breath broke out from somewhere in the crowd. A few people turned away, unable to endure the sight. Others stood frozen, as if held in place. Lyons shouted, his voice fully breaking, "Cut the feed. Shut the cameras down, now." He lunged toward the nearest reporter, yanking the microphone away, shouting again. "I said, shut it down. This is a military area." The reporter stepped back half a pace, but the camera behind him remained, pointed straight at lane 4. The cameraman looked at Lyons, then at the monitor, his hand hesitating over the controls. On the screen, the image of the military dog tag filled the frame. The engraving faded, but was clear enough to read. Evelyn Cooper stood in the technical room, both hands resting on the control board, headphones pressed tight to her ears. She heard every sound coming back from the range. When the name was spoken, she closed her eyes for a brief beat, then opened them. Her eyes were red, but her gaze did not waver. On the screen in front of her, the main camera was tightly zoomed on the mud-covered piece of metal. A technician turned to her, speaking softly. "Mrs. Cooper, they're asking us to cut the signal." Evelyn did not answer. She only looked at the screen, at the familiar name appearing amid mud and earth. Out on the range, Lyons struggled with a soldier trying to keep order. "Take him inside." Lyons pointed toward Thomas, his voice urgent. Immediately, Thomas did not resist when two soldiers approached. He walked slowly, his gaze still fixed on lane 4, where the ground remained wet and disturbed. As he passed the young soldier holding the dog tag, he stopped for a very brief moment. Their eyes met. The young soldier lowered his head, his hand tightening around the piece of metal. "Keep it," Thomas said quietly, his voice just loud enough for the other to hear. "Don't let it go back into the ground." The young soldier nodded, saying nothing. The crowd began to stir. Questions burst out, overlapping, unanswered. A few reporters tried to move closer, but were stopped by guards. The loudspeakers crackled, then fell silent for a brief beat, before coming back on at lower volume. Lyons turned to an aide and spoke quickly, his voice unsteady. "Contact higher command immediately. This is a technical issue, just an old pipeline." The aide nodded, but his eyes did not leave the patch of ground behind the target, where the camouflage fabric remained clearly visible. The camera kept rolling. The lens zoomed in tighter, focusing on the dog tag in the young soldier's hand. Mud dried on the metal surface, making the engraved letters stand out more clearly under the sun. Name, serial number, unit, all of it was there. A reporter spoke very softly, as if afraid of breaking something that was forming. "Do you see that?" The cameraman did not reply. He only adjusted the framing slightly, keeping the dog tag centered. Lyons stood in the middle of the range, sweat running down into his collar. He looked around, searching for a familiar gaze, a sign of control, but the people around him avoided his eyes. At lane 4, the wind blew through, making the camouflage fabric shift slightly, like a hand wanting to be pulled out of the ground. The camera was still running, and the name on the dog tag remained there, exposed under the Texas sun, with nowhere left to hide. Hero Range fell into chaos very quickly, not the loud kind of chaos, but a compressed disorder, where everyone spoke, but no one truly listened to anyone else. Questions burst out from the crowd, overlapping, colliding, then dissolving into the hot air. Guards moved in more tightly around the firing area, trying to keep distance between the scene and reporters advancing step by step. The cameras kept running, the small red lights on their bodies blinking steadily, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Charles Lyons rushed down from the stage. He moved faster than usual, his shoes striking the hard ground heavily, leaving clear prints behind. When he reached a reporter holding a microphone, he yanked it from the person's hand in a hurried, almost rough motion. "This is a technical incident," Lyons said loudly, his voice carrying through the outdoor speakers, trying to keep it firm while failing to hide the strain. "An old pipeline burst, nothing more than delayed maintenance." A few people looked at one another, no one responding. Their eyes remained fixed on lane 4, where the camouflage fabric and metal dog tags still lay exposed under the sun. Lyons' words could not reach what was physically present before them. "Step back," Lyons shouted again, pointing toward the firing area. Everyone stepped back. A young soldier hesitated, then stepped forward. He turned toward Thomas, his voice low. "Please come with us." Thomas stood still. He did not resist, nor did he show eager cooperation. He only nodded very slightly, as if he had been waiting for this moment. When two soldiers took positions at his sides, he walked with them, his pace slow, his back slightly bent, but each step steady. As they passed, a cluster of young soldiers gathered near the fence. One of them leaned closer and asked very softly, almost whispering, "Did you know this would happen?" Thomas turned his head slightly and looked at the young soldier. His gaze was calm, neither smug nor sorrowful. "I only know the ground does not lie," he replied, his voice low and even. The words were not loud, but the young soldier heard them clearly. He swallowed and stepped back half a pace, allowing Thomas to continue. Behind them, Lyons continued speaking into the microphone, repeating familiar phrases, trying to shape the narrative his way. But his voice began to break at the end of each sentence, as if he had to strain to keep the rhythm. Sweat soaked through his collar and ran down the back of his neck, even though the sun was no harsher than at the start of the ceremony. Thomas was taken to a military pickup truck, parked near a side gate. The door closed behind him with a dry click. Inside the truck, the space was narrow and hot. Thomas sat down on the metal seat, his back against the side panel, his hands resting on his thighs. The vehicle began to move. Through the small window, Thomas saw Hero Range slowly recede behind him, American flags still flying high, loudspeakers still hanging from steel poles, but the sound now broken and intermittent. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the cassette tape. The small tape player fit neatly into his other pocket. Thomas inserted the cassette and pressed the button. A faint, static hiss sounded. Then Ray's voice came through, clearer than before. Carrying a smile Thomas knew too well. "You still shoot like a machine, Tom," Ray said, his tone lightly teasing. "But don't let your eyes lose focus, or the shot will wander." Thomas closed his eyes for a brief beat. When he opened them, his reflection in the window glass looked tired but alert. He switched the player off, put the cassette back into his jacket pocket, then looked straight ahead. The truck stopped in front of a row of low buildings set apart from the main firing area. The command room was located there, a gray painted metal door, no large windows. Thomas was led inside, the hallway narrow and darker than outside. Yellowed lights hung from the ceiling, casting uneven patches of illumination. Lyons was already in the room when Thomas entered. He slammed the door shut behind the soldiers and motioned for them to leave. When the door closed, outside noise was abruptly cut off, leaving only the rattling hum of an old air conditioner. Lyons turned back and slammed his hand down on the table. "Who sent you?" he growled, without preamble. "Who is behind this?" Thomas stood across from him, not sitting down. He looked straight at Lyons, his gaze unflinching. "No one," he said. "I only fired at the place where you buried someone." The sentence fell into the small room, heavy and clear. Lyons froze for a very brief beat, then laughed, the laugh dry and higher than usual. "A hero," he said, his tone mocking but lacking its former solidity. "Do you think you just did something great?" Thomas did not answer immediately. He looked around the room, the bare walls, the clean desk, and a few neatly stacked files. "I just want to know," he said slowly, "whether the ground still remembers." Lyons walked around the desk, coming closer. "You wanted to smear me on live television," he said sharply. "Do you have any idea what you just broke?" Thomas turned with Lyons, maintaining eye contact. "I know I stayed silent too long," he said. "Today, I just stopped." Lyons sneered, but the sound broke midway. "You think you're a hero," he repeated, his voice cracking, no longer fully controlled. An old man bringing an old gun to a firing range. Thomas did not react. He simply stood there, like something that could not be pushed aside. Lyons spun back to the desk and swept a stack of papers onto the floor. "Everyone out," he shouted toward the door, even though no one was there. Out. Silence returned, thicker than before. Lyons breathed hard, his chest heaving. Thomas remained still, his arms hanging at his sides. Inside Thomas's jacket pocket, the small recorder continued running, its indicator light dim but steady, making no sound at all. The command room door slammed shut behind them with a dry, heavy, decisive sound. That sound cut off all noise from outside completely, leaving behind an almost uncomfortable silence. The room was not large, the ceiling lower than what Thomas remembered from older command rooms, yellowed lights hanging askew from the ceiling, casting uneven patches of light and shadow. Charles Lyons' shadow stretched across the wall behind him, distorted by the angle of the light. Larger than the man himself, Lyons stood still for a brief beat, his back to Thomas. He drew in a deep breath, his shoulders lifting and then falling, as if trying to gather the calm that had been torn apart outside. When he turned around, his face had changed. The political smile was completely gone, revealing a raw, unpolished tension. Lyons stepped to the table and slammed his hand down onto the wood. "Who ordered you to pull this stunt?" he growled, the last word drawn out with anger. "Who's behind it?" Thomas stood opposite him, a few steps from the table. He did not lean against the wall, nor did he look for a seat. His posture was straight, though his back was bent with age. He looked directly at Lyons, neither avoiding nor provoking. "No one," he answered slowly. "I only fired at the place where he fell." The answer made Lyons falter for a very brief moment. Then he laughed, the laugh dry and sharp. "Do you know what you just destroyed?" Lyons said, circling the table, his shoes pounding the floor in heavy beats. "The honor of this entire military." Thomas raised his eyebrows slightly. It was a small movement, almost negligible, but enough for Lyons to notice. "What honor buries a man under a practice target?" Thomas asked, his voice even, neither raised nor lowered. Lyons stopped, his face flushed, no longer able to maintain composure. "You think you understand this?" he snarled. "You think you know which side you're on?" Thomas did not answer immediately. He glanced around the room. the bare walls, a few maps hanging crooked, a filing cabinet carefully locked. I stand where the ground kept secrets on your behalf, he said. Lyons spun around, his eyes flashing. That idiot Ray, he blurted out, his voice higher, out of control. He tried to accuse me of skimming the death benefits fund. Who did he think he was? Ray's name echoed in the sealed room, with nowhere to go. Thomas looked at Lyons, his expression unchanged. And that frightened you, he said, as if stating an obvious fact. Lyons laughed, the sound broken and uneven. He rubbed his forehead, then laughed louder, his voice rising, shrill under the yellow light. I protect things people like you don't dare to, he shouted. I keep this system standing. Thomas remained still. He did not step back when Lyons moved closer. The distance between them is close to just a few steps. You call burying a man keeping it standing? Thomas asked, his voice low and clear. Lyons turned his back, took a few steps toward the wall, then spun around abruptly. You think a low-ranking soldier like Ray understood politics, he said bitterly. He thought justice was something that always needed to be spoken out loud. Thomas tilted his head very slightly. He only thought someone would listen. The words made Lyons freeze for a brief beat. He looked at Thomas, something close to panic flashing in his eyes, then quickly buried beneath anger. You think you're that person? Lyons asked, his tone mocking but no longer firm. I didn't listen, Thomas replied. That's the part I carried to today. Lyons returned to the table and violently swept a stack of files aside. Papers were scattered across the floor. You came here to make up for it, he roared. 30 years of silence, and now you play the awakened one. Thomas looked at the papers strewn across the floor, then back at Lyons. I came to see what you would say when there's no audience, he answered. Lyons sneered, but the laugh did not fully form. You think no one's listening, he said, his voice lower. You think your little performance is enough to take me down? Thomas did not respond. He stood there, letting the silence stretch another beat. The yellow light threw Lyons' shadow onto the wall, the shadow trembling slightly with each angry movement. Lyons breathed hard. He betrayed me, he said. This time, his voice lower, but sharp. He wanted to destroy everything. Thomas looked straight at him. You destroyed him first. The sentence fell, without echo, but heavy. Lyons stood still, his teeth clenched. 1 second passed, then another. He raised a hand to wipe sweat from his forehead, but his hand trembled slightly. You think you understand the weight of these decisions, Lyons said, his voice nearly grinding out each word. Some things have to be buried, so others can keep living. Thomas stepped forward one slow step, and some things, once buried, won't stay still, he replied. Lyons laughed again, but this time the sound was warped, nearly off-key. He stepped back 1 pace, then braced himself against the table. People like you, he said, his voice rising, are only good at talking about morality after everything is already done. Thomas did not argue. He simply looked at Lyons, as if waiting. The silence between them thickened. The air conditioner rattled on the ceiling, a steady, indifferent sound. Outside, Hero Range was still noisy, but no sound entered this room. Lyons straightened up, his eyes bloodshot. He stepped close to Thomas, standing directly in front of him, the distance just enough to feel each other's breath. What do you want? Lyons asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. An apology. Thomas looked straight at him. I want to hear you keep talking, he answered. Lyons opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw tightened, his hand clenched into a fist. In that moment, the political mask cracked enough to reveal beneath it a man sliding downhill, cornered by the very things he had buried. The closed room held everything, and neither of them had any intention of stopping. The air in the command room thickened with each breath Charles Lyons took. The door was closed, but the sense of pressure remained intact, as if the eyes outside could still pierce the metal walls. Lyons walked slowly around the room, his shoes striking the floor with dry, even sounds, no longer carrying the rhythm of a speech, but resembling the steps of an animal searching for an escape. He raised a hand to rub his neck, then let it fall, repeating the motion several times without effect. You think politics is clean, Lyons said, his voice not directed straight at Thomas, but as if speaking to the space of the room itself. You think those medals out there were hung with pretty stories? Thomas did not answer. He stood with his back against the wall, his arms hanging loose, his eyes following Lyons. He did not need to step closer. He did not need to interrupt. He had learned long ago that when someone began talking too much, the best thing to do was to let them continue. Lyons stopped in front of the table and braced both hands against the wood. "Some things have to be cleared away," he said, his voice lower, heavy, and slow. "Otherwise, this machine will seize up. Do you understand?" Thomas shifted very slightly, enough for Lyons to notice. He pulled a chair back and sat down, the movement slow, without extra noise. When Lyons turned back, Thomas asked only one question, his voice calm. "Then why is your villa registered under the Death Benefits Fund?" The question landed in the room like a hard object. Lyons froze for half a beat. His eyes flashed, not with surprise, but with anger mixed with alertness. "What do you know?" he roared, his voice rising sharply. "You don't understand anything." Thomas did not change posture. He leaned back in the chair, his eyes still fixed on Lyons. "Ray understood," he said, his voice low, without emphasis. "That's why you were afraid." Lyons burst into laughter, but the sound was incomplete. It broke in the middle, like a breath cut short. "He betrayed me," Lyons shouted, spinning toward Thomas. He wanted to drag everything down with him. Thomas looked at Lyons, his expression neither condemning nor sympathetic. "He wanted to speak," he replied. "You're the one who decided what was allowed to exist." Lyons stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking. He bent down, his face close to Thomas's. "Do you know how much I had to do to keep everything running?" Lyons said, his voice going hoarse. "Some people need only one ideal to tear an entire system apart." Thomas lifted his head, keeping his gaze level. "And you chose to bury it," he said. Lyons straightened and stepped back. He raised a finger, pointing straight at Thomas. "I did what had to be done," he said, almost hissing. "The government needs people like me, not old soldiers dragging morality out after 30 years. Thomas remained silent. That silence was no longer avoidance. It was like a trap, letting Lyons keep sliding forward on his own words. Lyons paced the room again, faster now, his breathing heavy. "You think Ray was a saint," he said, his voice tired but still sharp. "He didn't understand politics. He didn't understand that some numbers have to disappear for other numbers to exist." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "You call people numbers," he said. Lyons stopped abruptly. "I call it trash," he shouted, something in the way. As soon as the words left his mouth, Lyons froze, as if he himself realized he had gone too far. He stood still, his mouth opening and closing. In that moment, the final mask failed to rise in time. Thomas did not miss it. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still low, but sharp. "You didn't kill him for money," he said. "You killed him because he exposed you." Lyons clenched his fists. "You have no right," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You stayed silent all those years." Thomas nodded very slightly. "Yes," he replied. "And today you spoke." Lyons let out a short laugh, almost unhinged. "I speak because I'm right," he shouted. "I protect the honor of this nation." Thomas looked straight at him. "What honor needs to bury people?" he asked. Lyons stepped back until his back touched the table. He raised a hand to cover his face for a second, then dropped it. When he spoke again, his voice was higher than normal, out of control. "I didn't kill anyone," he screamed. "I removed a threat." Thomas did not argue. He let the space after that sentence stretch for another beat. That very pause pushed Lyons onward. "He betrayed me," Lyons repeated, his voice nearly breaking. "He was going to expose me. He was going to take everything from me." Thomas spoke slowly, each word clear. "And you were afraid." Lyons slammed his hand on the table. "Yes," he roared. "I was afraid. I was afraid of losing control." The words burst out too fast, too direct. Lyons froze, his eyes wide. In that moment, he understood what he had just said. The room sank into silence. The air conditioner hummed, a flat, indifferent rhythm. Thomas stood up. He walked slowly toward Lyons, but not too close. "You can stop," he said. "You can choose silence, like I once did." Lyons looked at Thomas, his eyes bloodshot. "No," he said hoarsely. "I can't go back anymore." He burst into laughter, loud, ringing, uncontrolled. "I buried him at target number 4. Lyons screamed. "I did it. I ordered it done, right under that damn target." The sentence hung in the air, clear enough that it could not be taken back. Lyons stood there, gasping, his hands shaking. Thomas stood opposite him, his gaze unchanged. In Thomas's jacket pocket, the recorder kept running, steady and silent. The air in the command room felt compressed to the point of thickness, each breath sounding clearer than the old air conditioner rattling on the ceiling. Charles Lyons leaned against the table, his shoulders sagging for a very brief moment before he straightened up, chest heaving, face flushed red with a mix of anger and panic. He opened his mouth almost immediately, the words bursting out fast, high, and sharp. "I didn't kill anyone." The sentence echoed in the sealed room, sounding more like a reflex than an argument, as if saying it quickly enough might turn it into truth. He stared hard at Thomas, his eyes waiting for a rebuttal. he could cling to. But Thomas remained still, neither interrupting nor changing expression. Lyons swallowed hard, his hand clenching and then releasing, as if he himself realized the previous line was not enough. He took a few steps around the room, his shoes pounding against the dry floor, his voice dropping but tightening. I did what the government needs done but doesn't dare do. He spoke faster, as if afraid of losing momentum, talking about responsibility, about decisions no one wants their name attached to, about how someone always has to stand in the shadows to keep the machine running. He looked up and pointed toward the ceiling, as if above it existed an invisible system watching and judging, a power he both served and feared. Thomas tilted his head very slightly, a movement so small it was almost negligible, but enough to cut across the stream of justification spilling out. His voice was low and even, without mockery. Is burying someone alive a duty? The question dropped into the room like a heavy object, needing no emphasis, its directness, leaving no path to avoid it. Lyons snapped upright, the chair behind him knocked over, and crashing hard onto the floor. He shouted, his face burning red, veins standing out along his neck. For national honor. His voice cracked at the end of the sentence, but he still strained to maintain a sense of righteousness. He spoke of things that had to be protected at all costs, of what would collapse if the truth broke free, of the so-called order he believed only he was hard enough to preserve. Thomas did not step back, his eyes now fully cold, each word falling slowly. What honor needs bodies under a practice target? The line was not loud, but it was enough to make Lyons falter for a very brief beat. Lyons shook his head violently, as if trying to shake off what he had just heard, his voice grinding out that Thomas understood nothing, that politics does not operate on cleanliness, that some numbers have to disappear for other numbers to exist. Thomas replied immediately, without thought. Ray understood. The name echoed inside the sealed room, and froze Lyons for exactly one beat before the anger exploded more fiercely than before. He spun around, shouting that Ray was in the way, that Ray wanted to expose him, that Ray did not know what he was touching. His voice wavered, no longer fully controlled, as if every layer of concealment had begun to peel away. Lyons slammed his hand down on the table, the wood shuddering with a dry, heavy sound. I killed him. Yes, he shouted, no longer avoiding it this time. The sentence came out decisive, without detours, stripped of verbal armor. He continued, his voice lower but sharp, talking about worms, about trees, about how a part has to be removed for the rest to survive. Those words had once been familiar to him, had once allowed him to sleep for many years, but spoken aloud in this closed room, they sounded bare and cold. The room fell into a heavy silence. The rattling of the air conditioner became painfully clear. Thomas looked at Lyons for a long time, long enough for the words just spoken to press down on the one who had spoken them. Then he stood straight, pulled the chair back with a slow movement, the legs scraping against the floor with a sharp, clear sound. His eyes now held none of the hesitation of a man who had once stayed silent. They were cold, deep, and still. Are you finished? Thomas asked, his voice so calm it made the question frightening. Lyons let out a dry laugh, broken and hollow, asking whether Thomas thought he had just won. Thomas stepped forward one pace, closing the distance between them, his voice no louder, but firm. I didn't come to win. I came to hear you speak. Lyons turned away, paced a few steps around the room, then stopped in front of a small dust-covered window. Afternoon light cut across his face, exposing the exhaustion and bitterness long hidden. He spoke about Ray, about people who believed that speaking out alone could change everything, about the fear of chaos, the fear of the day everything would burst open, and no one would be able to control it. Thomas answered evenly, You're afraid of losing power. Lyons spun back, admitting in anger that yes, he was afraid, then turned to attack Thomas, bringing up 30 years of silence. Thomas did not deny it. He only said he had come here to let Lyons say everything himself. Lyons continued, as if he had crossed a point of no return, saying he followed orders, that the government needed people like him. Thomas asked very softly, Who told you to bury him? Lyons looked down at the floor and answered flatly, Me. The answer dropped, heavy and naked, with no way to retract it. Lyons panted, saying he had lived with this for 30 years, that he was used to it. Thomas looked straight at him and replied that he had lived because of it and would fall because of his own mouth. Lyons laughed and repeated that he buried Ray at target number 4, that he personally chose the spot, his tone more self-affirmation than confession. Thomas said nothing more. He slid a hand into his jacket pocket, briefly touching something small, hard, and familiar, then let it go. Lyons noticed the movement, a flicker of unease crossing his eyes, and asked what Thomas was doing. Thomas lifted his head and answered with a single word, listening. Lyons opened his mouth, but there were no words left that could be taken back. Inside Thomas's jacket pocket, the small recorder continued to run, steady and silent, capturing the full price of the words that had just been spoken. The technical room was tucked away behind the main stage, separated from Hero Range by a row of thick walls and layers of old soundproof doors. Here, the sound of the ceremony did not boom outward. It entered through cables, through control panels, through headphones pressed tight against both sides of the head. Evelyn Cooper stood among the machines, her small figure swallowed by blocks of metal and flickering screens. The light in the room was cold and even, with none of the colors of celebration, only numbers, signals, and constantly shifting waveforms. The headphones were pressed firmly against her ears. Charles Lyons' voice came through them, no longer the familiar speech-making voice from the range, but a raw, hurried voice mixed with heavy breathing. Evelyn heard every word, every pause, every broken beat. When the sentence "I killed him, yes," burst out, her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the control desk. Tears welled up, rolled down her wrinkled cheek, and fell onto the cold plastic surface, but her hand did not shake. It stayed still, steadier than it had been at any point in the last 30 years. Evelyn tilted her head, gently lifted one side of the headphones to wipe away the tears, then put them back on. She did not allow herself to miss another word. Lyons' voice continued, rising and falling, mixed with the sounds of movement in the command room. Each sentence struck her memory like a blow, opening old images she had lived with for decades, mornings waking up alone, long sleepless nights, cold casualty notices, and brief explanations of a training accident. Beside the control panel, a photograph of Ray Cooper rested against a metal frame. The photo was old, the edges worn, the colors faded by time. Ray smiled lightly in the picture, his eyes not looking straight at the camera, as if thinking of something beyond the frame. Evelyn reached out and touched the edge of the frame, her fingers stopping at a chipped corner. She said nothing, but her lips moved slightly, a familiar reflex whenever that name surfaced in her mind. A young technician standing nearby turned and saw the tears on Evelyn's face. He hesitated and asked quietly, keeping his voice low so it would not reach a microphone, "Are you all right?" Evelyn did not turn her head. She did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the central monitor, where the audio channels were displayed as overlapping red and green waveforms. On one of those channels, Lyons' voice was running continuously, uninterrupted. Evelyn raised a hand to the headphones and adjusted them more firmly. She drew in a deep breath, held it in her chest for several beats, then let it out slowly. For 30 years, she had worked in rooms like this, in the role of the one behind the scenes, the one who kept sound running correctly, images aligned, programs smooth. She was used to not appearing on screen, used to her name never being mentioned, but today, everything in this room was pointing toward a choice she had prepared for a long time, even if she had never named it. Lyons' voice came again through the headphones, lower this time, but clearer. He spoke of fear, of power, of personally choosing the burial site. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, her gaze was brighter, not with hope, but with a resolve that had fully set. She raised her right hand and placed it on the large red button at the center of the control panel. The button was covered by a clear plastic guard. Above it, a warning label about system-wide broadcast. Her finger rested on the plastic cover. The surface was cool. Evelyn looked once more at Ray's photograph, then, at the screen, where the waveform of Lyons' voice was jumping violently up and down. She whispered very softly, as if speaking only to herself, "Enough." The word was so quiet that no microphone caught it, but it rang clearly in her mind. Evelyn lifted the plastic cover, the motion, decisive. She did not look at the technician, nor at anyone else in the room. Her finger pressed down on the red button. For a very brief moment, the system shifted state. Indicator lights changed color. The audio channel from the command room was pushed to maximum, overriding all others. Outside at Hero Range, loudspeakers that were normally used only for background music and announcements crackled lightly. Then Charles Lyons' voice poured out, clear and loud, no longer confined within 4 sealed walls. "I killed him, yes." His voice echoed across the range, bouncing off the iron fence, the dry ground, the rows of seats where the crowd had not yet dispersed. The sound could not be taken back, could not be edited, could not be treated as if it had never existed. It spread outward, reaching everyone still standing there, including those who had already turned to leave. Inside the technical room, Evelyn stood still, her hand still resting on the red button. Tears continued to fall, but her expression no longer trembled. The young technician spun around, eyes wide as he heard Lyons's voice blasting from the outdoor speakers. He opened his mouth to say something, then stopped. Looking at the control panel where the system-wide broadcast indicator was glowing bright, Evelyn removed the headphones and set them gently on the desk. In that moment, the technical room became strangely quiet. No voice in her ears, no commands, only the muffled sound bleeding in from outside. Lyon's voice amplified and distorted by open space, but still clear enough to be unmistakable. She leaned lightly against the desk and let out a long breath. 30 years of waiting did not end with gunfire, did not end with a confrontation, but with a single press of a hand in this cold room. Evelyn closed her eyes for one beat, then opened them and looked straight at the central monitor, where the signal was still running. Outside, Hero Range was falling silent in a completely different way than before. The voice coming from the speakers was no longer a prepared speech, but a raw truth pulled into the open. Evelyn could not see it, but she pictured it clearly. She had waited long enough to know it would not be loud in the way people expected. Another technician stepped up, his voice shaking. "Mrs. Cooper, we're broadcasting live." Evelyn nodded without turning around. "I know," she replied, her voice hoarse but steady. She straightened, wiped away the tears one last time, and looked again at Ray's photograph. The eyes in the picture were unchanged, calm, as if they had never left. Evelyn placed a hand on her chest and drew in another deep breath, this time not to restrain herself, but to stay firm. Outside, Lyon's voice was still sounding, sentence by sentence, word by word, pushing him farther from any path back. Evelyn no longer listened, but she knew it was happening. She knew that from this moment on, everything had crossed a point beyond retrieval. She stood there, among the control boards, among the flickering screens, quietly watching the broadcast signal remain lit, and somewhere beyond Hero Range, hundreds of people were hearing the same voice, the same truth. For the first time, all at once, the door to the technical room remained closed. Evelyn did not step outside. She stayed where she was, standing still, letting the sound continue to run. Hero Range sank into a silence unlike any moment before. It was not the silence of ceremony, nor the silence of waiting for the next shot, but a collective numbness that fell when hundreds of people realized at the same time that they had just heard something that could not be taken back. Charles Lyons's voice still poured from the outdoor speaker system, no longer smooth, no longer shaped by a stage or a script, but raw, broken, repeating the very sentences he had spoken in the sealed room. The sound struck the iron fences, the dry ground, everybody standing under the Texas sun, leaving a heavy void after each line. The crowd stood frozen. Those who moments earlier had been murmuring, arguing, and holding up phones to record now remained still, as if locked in place. A few soldiers held their weapons in their initial stance, then slowly lowered their barrels by instinct, as if their bodies themselves refused to continue the old role. Some loosened their grip on the stock, letting it rest against the sling, their eyes never leaving the stage. No orders were given, no slogans were shouted. Everything unfolded in a dense silence, the kind that appears only when power has just been stripped away in plain sight. At the front, the reporters froze for a very brief beat. Then almost simultaneously, without instruction, they kept their cameras steady. There was no pan away, no signal to cut. The lenses locked onto Lyon's face on the stage, capturing every smallest change. The sweat on his forehead, the wavering eyes, the trembling corner of his mouth as he heard his own voice booming from the speakers, loud and undeniable. Years of controlling words offered no help in this moment. Lyon stood rigid, his mouth opening, then closing. He stammered, his voice breaking. "No, impossible." The words vanished into the open space, weak and out of place. He turned, searching for a familiar face, a gaze still aligned with him, but those around him either avoided his eyes or looked at him with something changed. The practiced smiles were gone. The habitual nods no longer came. From the edge of the firing range, Thomas Hale stepped forward. He moved slowly, his posture still slightly bent, but his steps steady. The crowd parted automatically, forming a narrow path. No one spoke, no one stopped him. Thomas halted a few meters from Lyons and raised his hand, holding the small recorder in his palm, the device that had been there from the beginning, silent and patient. His voice was low, no louder than necessary. "You can say it again if you want." The sentence carried no challenge. It carried confirmation. Lyons looked at the recorder, then at Thomas, as if truly seeing him for the first time. Panic flashed briefly in his eyes, then turned into a belated surge of rage. He spun around and bolted toward the stairs leading down to the range, almost running. The red lights from television cameras sweeping across his face in uneven flashes. The speakers continued to blare. Lyons' shoes slammed against the steps, clashing chaotically with the broadcast audio. He shoved past a reporter blocking his way, knocking a microphone to the ground. No one chased him immediately, as if everyone needed a moment to understand that the rules of the game had changed. As Lyons reached the ground, dozens of red dots appeared on his chest, his shoulders, his abdomen, cold and precise laser points. Soldiers were already in position, rifles aimed, no command needed. A voice sounded from behind, low and decisive. "Stop, Charles." Lyons froze. He looked down at his chest, where the red dots quivered with each ragged breath. He let out a dry, twisted laugh, then looked up and shouted, as if to drown everything else out, "I did it for the country." His voice broke, mixed with desperation and pride, like a mantra repeated too many times over too many years. Thomas stepped forward once more, stopping at the boundary between the crowd and the ring of soldiers. He looked at Lyons, without anger, without pity. His voice was slow, each word clear. "No, you did it for yourself." The sentence landed quietly, but it severed the story Lyons was trying to cling to. He opened his mouth to continue, but the sound caught in his throat. Every argument that had once kept him standing now rang hollow under open light. The laser dots remained, unmoving, without emotion. Around them, the crowd began to breathe again, one person at a time, as if released from a long-held breath. Some raised their hands to their mouths, some lowered their heads, some stared directly at Lyons, eyes filled with disappointment and anger. The cameras kept rolling. No director signaled a cut. No one wanted to miss this moment. Lyons dropped to his knees in a sudden motion, his knees striking the hard ground with a sharp sound. He did not beg. He did not plead. He only panted, his arms hanging loose, his eyes empty. Power had left him not by a gunshot, but by his own voice, spoken too loudly, too truthfully, too late. Thomas stood there, not moving closer. He watched the scene as one watches an ending long set in motion. In his pocket, the recorder was still warm. He did not take it out again. There was no need. Far away, in the technical room, Evelyn Cooper stood before the screen, her hand resting on the desk. Steady, she saw Lyons kneeling through the main camera, saw the frozen crowd, saw the red dots on his chest. She said nothing. She simply stood straight, as if she could finally stand still. Hero Range was no longer a stage. It became an open stretch of ground where every layer had just been stripped away. No music, no slogans, no narration. Only the wind moved through the iron fence and the heavy breathing of those who had just witnessed the tide turn before their eyes. Thomas turned and walked slowly toward lane 4. No one stopped him. No one asked where he was going. His footsteps pressed into the dry sand, leading back to where everything had begun to surface. Behind him, Lyons remained kneeling, surrounded by lights and gun barrels. Ahead, the darkened ground behind Target 4 was still there, uncovered, unsmoothed. Thomas stopped at the edge of the lane and looked down at the earth. He did not kneel. He did not touch it. He simply stood, as if waiting for something else to happen, and all of Hero Range held its breath, waiting to see how the final part of the story would be spoken. Afternoon settled over Hero Range in a slow, heavy way, the sunlight stretching across the sand into a dark red color like dried blood, clinging to every tire track, every footprint, not yet erased. The wind blew lower, no longer carrying the noise of the ceremony, leaving only the rough sounds of cooling metal and sand rubbing against itself. The firing range, which had just witnessed the power collapse in full view, returned to a strangely raw state, as if it had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Charles Lyons was escorted away through a side route. He did not resist. His hands were held in front of his abdomen, wrists restrained, his steps slow and uneven. His eyes were empty, no longer searching for cameras, no longer probing the crowd for reaction. Years of practiced smiles and words fell from his face, leaving a hollow absence of expression. As he passed the darkened stage, he lowered his head very slightly, as if finally seeing the ground beneath his feet. No one called his name. No one voiced an accusation. The silence following him was heavier than any shout. Thomas Hale stood at the edge of the firing range, watching until Lyons disappeared completely. He did not sigh. He did not nod. He simply stood there, arms hanging loose, letting time reset its own order. When he turned, he did not head toward the parking area, but walked straight to lane 4. The crowd parted once again, without being told. The guards stepped aside. Reporters lowered their cameras, not because there was nothing left to record, but because this moment required no lens. Lane 4 sat slightly off to the side, the ground behind the target still wet and black, a darker shade than the surrounding sand. The seepage had stopped. but the earth had not yet dried, its surface wrinkled like a scar that had not closed. Thomas stopped at the edge of the lane and bent down very slowly. He dug with his hands, not using a shovel. The soil was soft on the upper layer, heavier below. Each handful of earth was placed neatly aside, without haste. He dug a small pit, deep enough to conceal what he carried, sealed enough that no one would need to look at it again. The M14 was placed beside the pit. The faded metal caught the afternoon light, reflecting a brief line of brightness before it died away. Thomas disengaged the action and checked it one last time, not as a ritual, but from a habit of leaving nothing undone. He placed the rifle into the pit, turned sideways, like setting down something that had completed its function. Sand was poured over it, layer by layer, lightly pressed down with the palm of his hand. When the ground was flat again, he stopped, sat beside it, and let out a long breath. "No one has to fire anymore," he said softly, as if speaking to himself, as if speaking to the earth that had just closed. The words did not need an answer. They existed long enough for the wind to carry them away, then vanished. Behind him, Evelyn Cooper approached. She did not hurry. Each step she placed on the sand was steady, unshaken. In her hands were the two halves of a dog tag that had been cleaned, the metal dulled, the edges worn. She sat down beside Thomas and placed the two halves together. The sound of metal touching metal was dry and cold, sharply audible in the quiet space. She held them for a beat, then set them down on the ground, right beside the filled pit. Evelyn looked at Thomas, her eyes tired but bright. "You still shoot, Tom," she said, her voice low, not trembling. "This time, you shot into silence." Thomas did not answer immediately. He looked at the earth, then at Evelyn's hands. He nodded very slightly, as if accepting a truth that had already been there. The wind rose briefly. A frayed American flag in the distance fluttered, without music, without narration. Those who remained kept their distance, no one stepping in. The firing range returned fully to its name, an open stretch of ground where the final sound had just departed. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and took out the cassette tape. He turned the player on. The familiar static hiss sounded, then Ray Cooper's voice appeared, faint but clear, like a breath carried through the wind. "If I don't come back," the voice stopped, just as it had stopped 30 years earlier. Thomas did not let the tape run to the end. He whispered, very softly, only loud enough for himself to hear, "I heard you." He switched the player off and placed the cassette on the ground beside the dog tag. The afternoon light tilted further, stretching the shadows of the two figures across the sand. No one spoke another word. There were no more questions, no more explanations. Only the silence of the earth, heavy and real, settled over everything that had been said. In the distance, the sound of departing engines faded and disappeared. Hero Range was no longer a stage, no longer a ceremonial ground. It stood bare, holding just enough traces to prevent anyone from pretending that nothing had happened. Thomas stood first, brushing sand lightly from his hands. Evelyn stood as well, closing her fingers tightly around the two halves of the dog tag, then releasing them, letting them remain with the earth. They did not look back when they left lane 4. Their footprints in the sand gradually blurred. The wind moved through, erasing the line between where things began and where they ended. There, beneath the newly closed sand, a rifle lay still. On the surface, silence held its place, needing no guard, and Hero Range, for the first time in a very long while, was quiet enough that one could hear the earth breathing. The story of Thomas Hale, Evelyn Cooper, and Hero Range does not end with the exposure of a crime or the collapse of a powerful individual. At a deeper level, it is a story about silence and the price people pay when they choose to look away from injustice. Thomas did not pull the trigger that year, but his silence became part of the bullet. 30 years later, he understands that silence is never harmless, only delays the truth and makes it more cruel when it finally emerges. The central message of the story is this: the truth can be buried, but it does not disappear. It remains in the ground, in memory, in people who refuse to forget. When power is built on lies, the words of those who hold that power are often the first thing to betray them. And sometimes, justice does not arrive through violence or revenge, but through the courage to let the truth be heard, even if it comes late. The story also raises a question for every viewer in the critical moments of our lives. Do we choose silence for safety, or do we choose to speak to live honestly? Not everyone gets the chance to make amends after 30 years, but everyone has the right to choose today. If this story made you reflect, consider sharing it so others can learn from it as well. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to continue with us in the next thoughtful, truthful, and meaningful stories.